JD Vance can go to Greenland and say, Denmark has not been a good steward of this territory, but this goes a lot deeper than that. There are critical raw materials there that are untapped gas and oil resources. It's a strategically sensitive location up in the Arctic, especially as Russia and China increase their military exercises up there. So there's a lot more to it than just going to Greenland because Denmark has not been a good steward of this territory.
Well, are those good reasons? Speak to the strategic aspect of that. We already have a Space Force base there. We can obviously go there as we see fit. What would owning the territory do for us that we don't have now?
Yeah, that's, I think, the key question here. I mean, we do have permanent military presence on Greenland. We've had it there for decades. And as I said before, it is strategically important. But remember, Donald Trump is very focused on this economic competition with China. And right now, China owns the mining, processing, refinement of about 80% of the world's critical raw materials. 25 of the European Union's 34 critical raw materials are located in Greenland. Now, all of this is untapped wealth, of course. This is a harsh territory. It's under a lot of ice. This is a small economy. There's only 56,000 people. They're heavily reliant on Danish subsidies. So that wealth is there, but it's expensive and it's hard to get to. So this idea that we're going to acquire Greenland and somehow reap all of these benefits, I think is a stretch.
Okay, so when we consider the potential reward here, which with the potential risk of disrupting a relationship with an ally, I do wonder when we consider Denmark and NATO more widely and potential tension in that relationship that could be further amplified by this. It already is pretty tense. Does this actually serve Russia, which theoretically with an acquisition of Greenland or what have you, would be trying to counter to a greater degree because it may create more division between the U.S. and its allies?
So this is Vladimir Putin's favorite thing. When NATO allies are at each other's throats and there are fissures and divisions within the alliance, he loves to come in and exploit those divisions through things like cyber warfare, hybrid warfare. But looking at Greenlanders, there have been polls that have been done. 85% of Greenlanders do not want to be part of the United States, but also there's polls done in the United States as well. 70% of Americans don't want Greenland as a part of America either. So overall, this is just a really unpopular idea. It's also a really unpopular visit. They've had to scale this visit down. And it's creating a bunch of tension with Denmark, with our NATO allies. And I think that the quote you said earlier, that this is creating a crisis that we haven't seen for quite some time, is very true. And it's going to be interesting to watch how this plays out, I think.
Vladimir Putin at a policy forum yesterday. It can look surprising, he said, only at first glance, and it would be wrong to believe this is some sort of extravagant talk by the current U.S. administration. It's obvious the U.S. will continue to systematically advance its geostrategic, military, political, and economic interests in the Arctic. So is he going to help us do this?
So that's really interesting because that sounds like something that Vladimir Putin would say about what he's done in Ukraine, right? It's this very imperialistic talk about regaining territory, regaining this greatness that has been lost. This is kind of Putin's approach to this, but it's also Donald Trump's approach to the United States and our foreign policy. So I think when it comes to Greenland, there is a sense that he wants to counter China, but also counter Russia in the Arctic. But again, the steps that would have to be taken for this acquisition to actually go through and the expense that this would cost the United States is extravagant. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we think through the realistic outcome here and the benefits that the United States would be able to reap from this.
Well, and I wonder if there is a parallel to the efforts that are currently underway, still being negotiated for the U.S. to have rights to minerals in Ukraine and other, according to our reporting at least, in a revised deal, right of first refusal essentially for investments in infrastructure. When we're talking about the kind of investment it does require to build out that capacity to get the ore out of the ground, to get it where it needs to go, how realistic are those objectives on the part of the United States?
So as I was mentioning, Greenland is harsh territory. This is the northernmost island in the world. It's the largest island in the world, but it's also under a ton of ice. So this would be very expensive. But, when you compare it to Ukraine, we don't need to own Greenland in order to help develop it and in order to help, reap some of those benefits that could come from potential mining. I think we're looking at benefits that would happen years down the road. We're not looking at months. Like this is a serious investment that would take a long time to actually come to fruition. But you can draw parallels here when it comes to what the president is trying to do in Ukraine. They're the breadbasket of Europe. They have a ton of critical minerals as well. So I think it just goes to show that you don't need to acquire a territory to be able to develop it and reap economic benefits from it.
Would it help to acquire that territory if you're building a so-called golden dome that the president has talked about? Would we be positioning missiles, for instance, in Greenland?
So the interesting thing about this is that I don't think the president has actually sat down with Denmark or the Greenlanders and said, here is what we actually want. He's had these not even thinly veiled threats. And I think the Greenlanders are sitting here thinking, have a conversation about what you want in terms of U.S. permanent presence here. Do you want more missiles? Do you want a golden dome, as Donald Trump has talked about? And I think that there would be some sort of negotiating possibility there. I don't think that's totally an off-the-wall idea, but they have to know what the United States wants in order to come to the table, and I don't think that this administration has taken that approach yet. And I think it would behoove them to maybe change their approach if this is really what they're looking for.
So instead of going there to scold, JD Vance could presumably be sitting down with officials to talk about these issues today, right?
Absolutely.
Not doing that, though.
They could have been doing this for months. And, Donald Trump pitched this idea back in 2019. This isn't new, but he wasn't that serious about it back in 2019. He sort of mentioned it. Other presidents have mentioned this in the past as well, back in 1946, back in 1867. So it's not a totally off-the-wall idea. But this approach that he's taking, it's extremely provocative. It's seen as extremely aggressive. And the Greenlanders and the Danes are sort of backing off and, are on the defensive, clearly. So I think that it would probably be a good idea for them to sort of change their approach here if they want to have a cooperative relationship, which I would assume that they would like to have a cooperative relationship given the strategic vulnerability of the assets that we have in Greenland.
Well, and when we consider in our final moments here, Rachel, this notion that a lot of what Trump is saying now hasn't changed from what he was saying in his first administration, inclusive of Denmark and other NATO countries who he thinks needed to pay more in their fair share, that Europe should be investing more in its defense. That does seem to only really be changing now, though, even though they knew he was coming into office and has espoused these ideas in the past.
Absolutely. And I don't want to criticize Biden too much, but I do think this message that he sent the Europeans that the United States is back after he won the election in 2020, ignored a lot of the political things that were happening under the surface. And the Europeans, I think, should have been preparing more over the last 4 years. But when it comes to Denmark, Denmark lost more soldiers per capita in Afghanistan in support of the United States than any other NATO troop contributing nation. So when JD Vance says that Denmark is not being a good ally, let's actually remember that they're increasing their defense spending along with all of the other NATO allies are increasing as well. And let's, I think, have a better relationship with Europe. I mean, this is a really kind of pointless fight that we're starting.